And good afternoon. My name is Derek Olson. I'm the president of WorldOregon, and it's wonderful to welcome you here this afternoon for an exciting program with author Julia Cooke, and we'll get to the program just shortly here. We're thrilled to be having this. She's going to be giving a short presentation and a reading, and my colleague Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs, will join her for discussion and facilitating questions from the audience. So get your questions ready to enter in the Q&A function. We will also post in the chat function of Zoom some links for things that we thought you might be interested in. For instance, I think a lot of you joined us for our most recent International Speaker Series event with Ari Shapiro. I hope you really enjoyed that. We have one last one coming up in about a month on April 7th with Tom Colicchio, who is the famous chef from Top Chef. Among other things, we'll be talking about combating food insecurity, and it should be a really fascinating program. Also, another big program that we just added to our events page is Cass Sunstein. Some of you may have known him as Mr. Samantha Power. His spouse, Ambassador Samantha Power, the new head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, spoke for us last year in the International Speaker Series. Mr. Sunstein will be speaking about his new book on truth and lies. And then lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you all to join us for our virtual annual fundraiser, WorldQuest, which is coming up on April 29th. I'm posting a link in the chat to that where you can RSVP and get all the information about the event coming up. Again, that's coming up at the end of April, April 29th. And now to today's program. Reminder, today's program is a Zoom webinar where everyone is muted and their camera off except for our speaker and WorldOregon staff. We will be recording this for posterity to post on YouTube, so mind your P's and Q's. Post your questions in the Q&A. We'll post some links in the chat, including a link on how to buy her book from our partner at Broadway Books, a local bookseller who, as many of you know, is a great partner for a lot of our events. Ms. Cooke will be speaking today on her book, Come Fly the World, the Jet Age Story of the Women of Pan Am, and particularly be highlighting Pan Am Stewardesses' role during the Vietnam War, which she thought would be of particular interest to our audience. She is a widely published author and has been in Condé Nast Traveler, the New York Times, Smithsonian, Village Voice, Virginia Quarterly Review, where she's a contributing editor, and essays published in a number of publications, including Tin House, which is run by a local Portland publisher. Her first book, The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba, was published in 2014, received a lot of great reviews, and was the subject of her previous presentation for WorldOregon. She's discussed Cuba a lot on various things, including NPR's All Things Considered and several other PBS shows, and has done lectures and talks in some of our sister World Affairs Councils around the US. She's a recipient of fellowships from the Norman Mailer Center, the Constance Saltonstall Foundation and Columbia University, and holds an undergraduate degree from Georgetown and a Master's of Fine Arts from Columbia University. Without further ado, our very distinguished and talented author, Ms. Julia Cooke.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'd like to talk for a few minutes, and then I have a short 5 to 10 minute reading. I'll talk about my research a little bit, and then I would love to hear some questions from you guys. If other events have been a guide, we may have some former stewardesses or more recent flight attendants in the audience. And I'd love to hear from you too. In the chat probably makes the most sense. What airline you worked for, what years, where you're based, or where you were based, I guess. So broadly, so I'm going to tell you about my book. Come Fly the World is about International Stewardesses of Pan Am, which was in its day the only American airline that flew exclusively international routes, which is to say that if you got on a Pan Am plane, you knew that you were going to step off the plane in a foreign country. It's about the places that the stewardesses flew to, the way that they moved through the world, the work culture that they forged, and the largely unseen role that they played in the Vietnam War. More specifically, the book is about the lives of 5 women and their time flying. It's about how flying impacted the choices that they made, the lives that they led. It's also about the fun that they had, the places that they visited, the challenges they faced. One reviewer said that it reads like a novel, which a nonfiction writer always loves to hear. But it was really important to me that this book be about real women and that it be as factually verified as was humanly possible to do. So the book first began, some of you in the audience I know my parents. My father worked for Pan Am until I was 9 years old. I really honestly, though, had not thought very much about the airline until when I was living in New York. I was writing a lot about art and architecture and travel and culture and food and politics, wide range of things. I read that at some point the TWA terminal, the Pan Am Historical Foundation was going to host an event at the TWA terminal. I'd always wanted to tour the terminal. Some of you may have heard of it. It was designed by Eero Saarinen in the late 50s. It's absolutely stunning. Now it's a hotel, so you can go to it whenever you want. But back then, 7 years ago, it was only open for advanced tours if someone special hosted an event. The Pan Am Historical Foundation hosted one such event. I went to this event and I met a couple of former stewardesses for the airline for Pan Am. And I was magnetized. I spent the whole event talking to them. They were fascinating. They were so sophisticated, so smart. I had anticipated that they would talk about global cities with a level of authority that I hadn't really heard before, but I had not anticipated that they would talk about geopolitics with this casual intimacy, as if they had had martinis with prime ministers or sat down to discuss the machinations behind, the newspaper headlines that the rest of us were reading, or the rest of them in that era. So the book was born out of those first conversations. I wanted to know everything about them. I wanted to know how they had acquired the attitudes that so impressed me, or the knowledge that so impressed me, and the attitudes that I found fascinating. One of those women, I offered her a ride home in my car back into Manhattan, and she accepted. And I said, "You didn't buy a train ticket back?" And she said, "Why? I never buy a train ticket or a plane ticket back from anywhere. You never know what's going to happen once you get somewhere." And for a 75-year-old woman to be saying that to me, I found incredible, just thrilling. So I wanted to write this book. I met more and more of these women. And in that first phase of research, as I was just going to events and meeting women and interviewing them and talking to more and more people, I really sensed that these women were never really given their rightful place in the history of restless, trailblazing, world-changing women, largely because of the pop culture image that had been foisted upon them. Coffee, Tea, or Me came out in 1968, and that book and the sexualized marketing of the airlines in that era really did a lot to make the American public believe that these women were flying largely for shopping and dates, which was pretty far from the case from what I learned. Not that they didn't shop or go on dates, but their desire to do what they were interested in doing in flight, what propelled them to fly, was much more complex, much more serious, and they were much more intellectually stimulated than the mainstream American media made it out to be. So part of the reason why I focused on Pan Am was because of that global aspect of the airline. Pan Am had always been involved with the U.S. government dealings. One trip, the founder and CEO of the airline called the airline itself the chosen instrument, and that's in reference to the chosen instrument to implement the national interest. He cultivated relationships at the highest levels of government, and indeed he cultivated a certain reliance upon the airline. FDR called him, quote, "the most fascinating Yale gangster I've ever met." So the US press vaunted the Pan Am contribution to World War II, the Korean War airlift, and eventually the Vietnam War. Less considered than the airline's contribution and the decisions that were made by the men in boardrooms was the fact that women were crewing every single one of these flights. So on every plane that went into the Vietnam War, where they were shot at, where mechanical failure grounded some women in Da Nang numerous times, and on and on. The list of what actually happened is long. These were women who were thought of at home with a certain image, and yet they were going into these these very dangerous situations. So that contrast really impressed me, and I found it fascinating, the contrast between the glamour and the grit. So I'm going to read a little bit about from the first chapter of my book that starts to talk about the Vietnam War. To set the scene a little bit, this is chapter 4, page 35-ish. So that's how far into the book it is. And this is just after, this is in 1966, when the troops are beginning to be built up in Vietnam. And when the US government has just promised, the Department of Defense has committed to sending every soldier on 5 days of R&R, but has told the press that the big barrier to fulfilling that promise is air travel. They don't have enough planes. So Pan Am steps in, and the president, Harold Gray, in an act of corporate magnanimity that he ensured would be well covered in the press, offered to send 1,800 military passengers from Vietnam to Hong Kong or Tokyo and back for $1 a month. Okay. From the start, the media vaunted Pan Am's involvement in the war effort, though 12 other carriers also supplemented military aircraft with charter passenger and cargo flights to and from Southeast Asia. To every woman who crewed any airline into Vietnam, the US government issued a slip of paper that designated her a second lieutenant in the US Armed Forces. Every stewardess was to carry her Geneva Convention's identification card at all times in case she was captured by enemy forces. It ensured that she would be treated as a prisoner of war. You are an ambassador of the United States of America, Pan Am instructors had drilled into each stewardess in her 6 weeks of training in Miami. You represent America, they said. If you don't want this job, 100 women are waiting to take your place. Every stewardess who had signed up to move to Hong Kong had, as evidence of her ambassadorship, the eagle wings of the U.S. Department of Defense crest watermarked across her name, rank, service number, and date of birth on her Geneva Conventions card. The significance of this assignment reflected a natural progression for Claire Christensen. For years, she had kept herself keenly aware of opportunities for advancement within Pan Am. She was determined to rise. Claire, tall and composed, knew that her stately bearing inspired confidence. Claire had known that she would love working as a stewardess since she was a teen. Aviation is the most exciting thing in the world, the character played by Jane Wyman said in the 1951 comedy Three Guys Named Mike, when she interviewed for a position on American Airlines. God didn't mean for people to be strangers, and with commercial aviation, people all over the world are becoming neighbors. After seeing the movie in her small Ohio hometown, Claire had stuck her head through the cardboard cutout of Wyman's uniformed body in the theater's lobby. Even as a teenager, she'd had to lean down. Claire was 5'10", an inch over Pan Am's limit. Still, she hoped. She had always wanted to do something interesting with her life. She wrote a letter to Pan Am in 1955, after 2 years of studying theater at college. Pan Am had garnered headlines for ordering a fleet of 45 new jets, the largest single purchase in the history of commercial aviation. You're ordering great new big airplanes, Claire wrote. Will you take a taller woman too? A month later, she opened an envelope that contained an application and a form letter telling her that interviews took place in New York. But there, in New York, the company reps told Claire that the application was a mistake, that she would never be hired. She was far too tall. She met the weight requirements, though, and her composure and high cheekbones did not hurt. Her other interview in New York had been with Eileen Ford's new modeling agency. And since she was there anyway, they said, they'd interview her. Her mother and sister cried when her acceptance letter arrived in Ohio. Stewardesses, they believed, were loose and immoral. Claire pointed out the flaw in their logic. She was neither loose nor immoral, and she would be a stewardess. Plus, her travel benefits extended to her mother and sister, too. By 1965, Claire had been flying for nearly a decade. She participated in the rollout of the first 707 jets. She watched her flight-shy mother take a full advantage of her travel benefits, and she flew Richard Nixon just after he lost the California governor's race. She tried to find another job within the company, as her roles of stewardess and then purser, the chief stewardess who oversaw safety procedures, flight manifests, any necessary reports, and the rest of the crew's assignments, grew rote. Claire applied for 3 ground positions: grooming supervisor, recruiter, and crew supervisor. In the first instance, she lost out to another woman who had waited for years for this single management position customarily filled by a woman. In the latter 2 instances, she was neither rejected nor accepted. No openings was all she heard back. So she moved around, climbed as high as she could as a stewardess, and leveraged her seniority to switch bases and fly different routes. Still, with enough repetition, even once thrilling trips became routine. In Tokyo in 1965, she experienced something different. Her plane was rerouted. No one explained why the aircraft ran empty to Saigon, or why, as it approached the city, fighter jets pulled into the surrounding clouds. Claire's excitement grew as she watched army planes moving against the clouds. Wheels hit the tarmac, the plane coasted to a stop. After a while, General William Westmoreland and Maxwell Taylor, the ambassador to Vietnam, stepped aboard. A line of passengers followed. "Thank you," they said to the assembled crew before exiting the plane, "for taking our families home." Claire understood that each passenger she greeted and helped into a seat was leaving a city on the verge of war. Anti-American demonstrations in Vietnam had escalated, and the embassy feared that any violence against the families of State Department employees would be politically catastrophic. Ambassador Taylor wanted the approximately 2,300 dependents shuttled out of the country before the real fighting began. Claire had never participated in anything so overtly political. She believed fervently in her country, its goals, its leaders. Years earlier, as she shook Mr. Nixon's hand, she had told him gravely, "I'd vote for you whenever, sir." When the call sounded for volunteers to be based in Hong Kong for these new R&R shuttles, Claire signed up immediately. Layovers in Hong Kong always lured her to Pacific routes. She was drawn to this city, wrapped around a harbor, encircled by green mountains, its verticals theatrical, its colors bright. Claire loved the city lights from the rooftop restaurants, the precision tailors, the variety of fantastic foods. She could stretch the monthly foreign station allowance of $300 to cover housing, transportation, food, and a tailored dress or a trip within Asia. Her paycheck itself went straight into her bank account back home. The mounting sum would buy her future independence. Living in Hong Kong would be luxurious. Apartments were spacious and usually came with an ama or a houseboy, so Claire would not have to do the cleaning herself, which pleased her very much. And the job held a tang of danger and purpose. The US military in Vietnam would stop communism from spreading around the world. Participating in that effort, Claire thought, sounded wonderful. Here was representation on a higher level than dinner service. Here was a kind of ambassadorship, unscripted, sophisticated, and largely unsupervised. So that's at the beginning of the book. As you can imagine, Claire's perspectives change a little bit over the course of the book, as do those of many of the women who flew these soldiers in and around Vietnam, as did the perspective of the American public at large. So this book, one of the things that I really enjoyed about researching it and working on it was the task of trying to put into context what these women did within the many changes and the great cataclysms of that era in American history. There was the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the women's movement, all working at the same time, all changing people's lives at the same time. And what I found really remarkable was looking at the ways in which these women, their lives were changed by those changes, but they really also made some of those changes happen. A number of the women were active in the Vietnam War protest movement. A number of them were also active in the feminist movement. Some of them, not the specific women profiled in this book, but stewardesses, one little known fact about them is that a lot of the labor law that later lawsuits relied upon as precedent came from some very important lawsuits that stewardesses brought against the airline to dismantle unequal hiring practices, gender-based hiring practices. So that's what this book charts over what's happening over the years between 1966 and 1975. Over the course of writing, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, feminist movement, obviously, but I also learned really fun things like packing tips from the training manuals that I studied, that I found in the archives. I learned what foods for a dinner party fly the best across the Atlantic Ocean and across the African continent. If you're hosting a dinner party in Liberia, what do you want to bring from New York? I learned about how the glamour of the jet age was constructed. It was 360 degrees. It was uniforms, it was buildings, it was menus, and it was also the women. I think it was a lot of the women, in part because they didn't really fit any stereotyped mold. They existed in a real middle ground, something that they were feminine, but also feminist. They anticipated a lot of the changes that would come about in the 90s, really, and 2000s, like third wave feminism. To me, when I met them, the more time I spent with them, the more I started to see them as feminists of the third wave, even as the second wave was happening. Globalized shopping in the 60s, they knew exactly what to buy in which place, in a way that, nowadays we can go to a department store and get items from different countries, the best things that any country will sell. We can buy that in the US. Back then they couldn't, but that's how these women shopped. They also were doing soft diplomacy long before that term was really understood. And that's what I found fascinating about them. So Tim, I think if you have any questions, sure. I can wrap up now and just...
Yeah, let's just jump in. We'll start talking, and then for anyone in the audience, put your questions into the Q&A and we'll get around to those. I think I want to start with, you make a very, very conscious effort to use the word stewardess. And I'm curious, was there pushback on that, and why the very, very deliberate use of that term?
Mm-hmm. It's because the first couple of women, those first two women, and then others that I met of that era they corrected me. When I first met them, I called them flight attendants. And they said, no, we are not flight attendants. We are stewardesses. And to me, it seemed like the job that they performed in the moment was a different job than that which is performed by flight attendants. It seemed to me like a way of preserving the specificity of the role that they played. So, for example, one of the women in the book, one of the primary characters, primary subjects, is Tori. She flew for United. She was based in LA. So when Pan Am sold the Pacific routes in 1986, she moved over to United. She flew into the 2000s. I call her, when I speak of her casually, I call her a flight attendant, because that's the job that she performed. She was a stewardess and then she was a flight attendant. But for the women who only worked in the 60s and 70s, I use the term stewardess.
So, you touched on this a little bit. This was a really, really tumultuous period. Shifts in terms of labor and social movements, and you highlighted a little bit of the connection with the American feminist movement. But I'm curious if you can was this a surprise to you, finding these connections between international stewardesses and folks who were involved in the feminist movement? And I'm curious if there was pushback from the management of Pan Am for people who were doing things like protesting the war or protesting labor practices, and how did they navigate that?
So the women at Pan Am are, as one might expect, they should say, I should back up a little bit and say that, the hiring, this was a very selective group of people. The hiring practices were incredibly rigorous. They were subjected to weight, height, physical requirements, but they all had to be college educated and speak 2 languages. And in their interviews, they were challenged to think on their feet very much. Pan Am needed women who could problem solve very quickly, who could, who could think on their feet, for lack of a better term. These were very bright women.
Great. So I'm curious, when you started the project, did you have any idea you were going to go down the rabbit hole of cultural and political history that you did?
Not at all.
And you touched on a couple things, but what most surprised you in going down that rabbit hole and coming back out again?
Yeah, I to be honest, I was shocked by the level of involvement that these women had in the Vietnam War. The fact of what they did they were on every one of these flights, they were, therapists and girlfriends and cheerleaders. And, they talked to young men who, if you think about what a plane was, a plane full of soldiers, a lot of those men had been drafted into war and didn't necessarily want to be there. So these women were performing an incredibly delicate role for them. Some of them, were aware that these were the last American women that they were possibly ever going to see. And that sense of gravity was not lost on the stewardesses themselves.
So how did you find the women that you ended up profiling? And was it hard to limit it to, 5? And kind of talk about that. And were they really open to share their stories with you?
Yeah, they were very open to share their stories with me. They were excited, I think, to be talking to someone who was interested in this aspect of what they did, and who wasn't just asking which celebrity they had flown where, or asking for the more salacious aspects of the job. I found them mostly through the Pan Am crew alumni organization called World Wings International. It's a really strong network. I started just going to these events that they had. I would go to, they have these conferences and conventions that draw like 300 to 700 people to different global cities once a year. And they're really fun. These women know how to have fun. So I would just go to these parties and sit at tables and talk to them. And one person led me to another person. Everyone had another person that they thought, you have to talk to so-and-so. She has this amazing story about blah, blah, blah. And then I would talk to so-and-so and see that, in fact, her story about blah, blah, blah was incredible. And just, the narrative started cohering around that.
So what did the stewardesses say about the experience of flying then versus now? And do they lament that loss of glamour or celebrate that flight is more accessible to more average people?
They don't necessarily, both, and they also are very aware that the changes in the job were necessary on some level. They're for the most part very proud to have contributed to the changes in labor practices that their generation of women really did usher in. The fact is that in the early 60s, it was a job that women worked for on average for 2 years, in part mostly because they were pushed out. They were required to quit when they got married or turned 32 or 35, which was a deeply sexist practice in and of itself. The airline wanted women to remain young and seemingly available to the mostly male passengers. Women were a way that airlines could compete with one another in an era of fixed prices. So they none of the women that I interviewed that feature heavily in the book were the plaintiffs in the lawsuits that that changed those policies. But a number of them really took advantage of those changed policies. Tori, for example, flew until she was in her late 50s. Both Karen and Lynne flew for 7, 8, 9 years. And Hazel flew for 40 years. So these women, their lives reflect the changes of the era. I think they're aware that there is a cost to those changes. Flying, the women are no longer all young and beautiful. And I think they're aware that that's a good thing. And that they're not just women.
So when did Pan Am's monopoly on international travel end? And how did that change its business model and the work of these women? And I don't know if you know, but when were male stewards first hired?
So last question first. Male stewards were first hired in 1972. I mean, they had been hired previously. To a brief summary of the profession itself. The first stewards were the first airline crew. It was stewards. It was men in the model of trained stewards. And it was only after the airlines realized that women could quote, more naturally reassure or calm a frightened passenger. And it was more socially acceptable for women, for nurses, to be ministering to airsick passengers. So that was when the shift began in the early 1930s. And then World War II solidified the role as a woman's job. And then in the 50s and early 60s, that was when the women as selling point for a specific airline kind of started happening. That, because prices were fixed by the government, the airlines needed to compete via other means. And, they a lot of that was their image. So they relied upon the women to create this image. Over the course of the 60s, a bunch of men said, what the hell, it's a cool job. We want to be able to fly too. They brought lawsuits. A man named Celio Diaz brought a lawsuit against Pan Am, which was decided in 1972. And that was when men joined the cruise. And I forget what the first half of your question was. Sorry.
How did the losing the monopoly on international travel, how did that change the business model and the work of these women?
So Pan Am sold off different routes bit by bit. So the women wound up shifting, like Tori, for example, moved to fly with United in 1986 when Pan Am sold the Pacific. So it shifted their experiences of the airline, mostly because they moved with the routes. They switched airlines. Tori will talk, it wasn't specifically the purview of it wasn't within the time range that I was studying. So I didn't really ask a ton of questions about it, but she would tell me a little bit about she's told me about the difference to her in corporate culture between Pan Am and United. I think that, there was a huge cost to the sexualization of the women's roles and to, the level of objectification that they were subjected to in the 60s and 70s. But there was also, the fact of such a cohesive, monolithic or homogenous group of people being hired for a single job lent itself to a degree of unity. These were women who had been chosen for being women in an era in which, they would have had to, if they were going to law school or medical school or any number of other, if they were, trying to enter stereotypically male professions, they would not necessarily have felt as united as they did in these crews of only women. Then when she joined United in '86, it was, a much more heterogeneous crew. And I think there was an emotional cost to that on some level from her perspective.
So it is hard not to, of course, look at some of the pop culture touchstones like, Catch Me If You Can, certainly Mad Men. But why do you think that the Pan Am legacy is still so nostalgic for us in this moment?
Yeah. So one of the things that I mentioned, this sense of 360-degree glamour. The airlines worked really hard to construct this image of themselves. I think it's really easy to look at the past and only see that constructed glamour and not consider, for example, the people who were left out of that image making. It's easy to, in the same way that Mad Men captured this sense of, the cultural nostalgia that we have for that era and the ennui of the moment, the era, which we are also feeling or have been feeling recently. It's easy. We have access to the world on an unprecedented level. And frankly, flight crews today are much more equitable. The flight crews have many more rights. They act on them. They reflect America in a way that the flight crews did not back then. And so I think it's really easy to look back and feel nostalgia for that era. What I think is remarkable is that the women, the women themselves, so many of the people that I talk to that have this nostalgia about that era tend to not really understand that the women themselves ushered in a lot of the changes that then changed. I'm not explaining this well, but that the changes that made it less glamorous, but were necessary changes, and that the women that everyone's being very nostalgic about are in fact the reason that they were so trailblazing, and that's why the changes happened. If that made any sense.
Oh, absolutely. Now I'm curious. I mean, you've got these wonderful snapshots of these women's lives. I have to ask, has anyone talked to you about optioning this for television or movies? Because I mean, I could see it. I could totally see it.
Yeah, I'm talking to someone next week about it.
Cool.
So yeah, I've got a couple of interested parties. I'd love for that to happen.
So you mentioned diving into the history of that moment, civil rights movement, Vietnam War. How did you go about researching the story, the sort of periphery, apart from the interviews with your cast of stewardesses?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm gonna lean down and pick something up off the floor. Okay, I can show you what my process was on some level. I was really lucky. The women that I focused on, 2 of the 3 had saved the letters that they sent home. They had asked their mothers to save them, and they were willing to share them with me. So my research process for so on a macro level, I read a lot of really great books. There are a ton of excellent books about the late 1960s. And that was the big research, the cultural setting, right? The scene around the women's lives. But I felt very strongly when I was doing my research for this book that I wanted the women's personal experiences to guide my research. I didn't want to be researching and then trying to find examples in their lives that fit this larger cultural narrative. I didn't want to turn the women into object lessons in any ulterior motive, anything that I wanted to prove. I wanted to talk to them and let their experiences guide. So the way that I did that was I would interview them and I would read letters. These are letters from Karen from 1965. I have a huge stack of letters from her, from tons. They're postmarked from all over the world, from Israel, from Germany, Hong Kong, Lebanon. And then I would compare, I would do the letters, interviews, and then I would compare what I was told with, more traditional research in books like this Fall of Saigon by David Butler, fantastic book. And I would go back and forth between the reading and the interviewing, and that was my research process. So
of the many scenes that you write about in Come Fly the World, which are ones that you would most like to have witnessed or been a fly on the wall for?
I would love to just have been on any of the layovers with any number of these women. Karen, for example, she really liked to wander cities by herself. She wouldn't often, she didn't spend that much time with her fellow crews. She was a bit more solitary. And she told me about the days that she spent in Hong Kong and just wandering. She had these routines. She had these circuits that she liked to do, to go to get dim sum and then go through this one neighborhood and stop for dinner at this one place. And then it sounds so quotidian. There are a million incredible scenes and much more attention grabbing or dangerous flights that would have been interesting to see or participate in, but it's hard for me to brush aside the sense of the danger that these women were in many instances. So to me, what I really would be excited to do is just hang out with them on any given day in any given place.
So here's a question from an audience member. She says, I travel back and forth from the US to Europe, and I have witnessed many instances of migrant relocations, repatriation. I guess the plane cabin reflects the status of the world. How was Pan Am different than TWA?
First of all, so that's kind of 2 questions or one statement. Yes, I'm confirming. I found that as well. The plane cabin really did reflect the status of the world, and it reflected, and the women took the responsibility very seriously. They really wanted to be there for people, for example, people who were new immigrants from the Soviet bloc moving to the U.S. Were memorable. Refugees out of Vietnam as well. A lot of, it was, they were thinking, it was a considered fact of their jobs. Pan Am different from TWA. Pan Am was much more intertwined with the US government. So it had a level of access and a level of cachet that TWA didn't necessarily have. Pan Am also on a technical level, it was an airline of firsts. So that's the fact. In the 1920s, it was the first to radio, to have radio contact. In the 30s, it was the first to have ticketed international passenger service. In the 40s, it was the first to have a round the world service. So on, and it was the first to fly the jet plane in 58, the first to bring the 747 to market in 1969 and 1970. So on a technical and cultural level, it was associated with, firsts, with glamour, with the government, in a way that TWA was not necessarily.
So, I don't know, around 1971 to 75, golden age of air travel. It was also the golden age of hijacking. And I'm curious if that played into any of the stories that you heard about, or how they trained the stewardesses to deal with those kinds of conflicts and conflict resolution.
Yeah, it was the golden age of hijacking, and hijacking at the beginning of that golden age of hijacking, it was seen as a novelty. It was seen as something kind of fun and crazy to happen. This was before it had yet been fatal. There hadn't been any casualties or fatalities yet. That would soon happen. It would be a year or two into it, but for a brief period of time, it was seen as something fun and funny that happened. And Tori, again, was on a flight out of JFK. Pan Am ran shuttles down to Puerto Rico, and she was supposed to be on a flight to Puerto Rico, but on a fluke was asked to wait and staff the next one. And the flight that she was supposed to be on, halfway through, they're over somewhere, over South Carolina or something. And the captain called her into the cockpit and said, hey, weren't you supposed to be on flight 281? And she said, I was. Why? And he said, that was just hijacked to go to Cuba. Lucky you. And Tori's instinct, and this is so telling, was, damn it. No, unlucky me. I wish I'd been on it, because she always wanted to go to Cuba and tour Cuba. Because this was not seen as seriously as it certainly later would be, the women were told to become a neutral friend to the hijacker. Their femininity was played upon. They were told to lean into that femininity, and to try to not rile him up more. The hijackers were almost exclusively male. There are a couple of women hijackers, but not very many. And they were told to not serve alcoholic or caffeinated beverages. And to just keep the guy talking, and to try to. This is what I find really interesting. They were told to try to get him to have the idea that they should land the plane. So the kind of mental, hoops that you have to go through to do that, I find interesting.
So a question from one of my coworkers, Karen Ettinger, and she flew for World Airways during that time and found out years later that the pilots and co-pilots were receiving combat pay to fly into Vietnam. Did Pan Am stewardesses receive that pay as well? Because the World Airways stewardesses did not.
No, they did not. And that is fascinating, Karen. How maddening. That is, yeah, no. Pan Am stewardesses were given the option to not fly Vietnam routes. It was seen as, it was optional. They couldn't be forced to take those routes. But if they chose not to take those routes, then they would be boxed out of Southeast Asia in general, because the planes, it was sometimes kind of a game of musical planes in a way, and crews could be moved onto different flight patterns or flight routes as needed. And so if they declined Vietnam War routes, they probably wouldn't get to Guam or Jakarta or any number of different places that they, for a group of incredibly curious women who had signed up to travel, that was not something that they were willing to risk doing.
So you've mentioned that your dad, Roger, who is a wonderful friend of WorldOregon, was an attorney for Pan Am. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your family's experience with Pan Am, but also did you mine their memories for how you approached this book?
I really didn't. I didn't talk to my dad very much about this book until the very end. I had him read the book just before the final pages, and he found one error. It was what's a false cognate, that there was a bus called the Carry Bus that I thought it was the CARRY bus that took stewardesses to JFK. In fact, it was a company that ran the bus called the CAREY bus. It was a brand name. So Roger caught that error, which was great. But no, his area of expertise, he's an attorney. He was negotiating the deals around the fall of the Berlin Wall, and selling the Pan Am's IGS, Inter-German Service, to Lufthansa. So he was doing things like that. He was negotiating as you can imagine, as an attorney. He was doing things that were pretty far removed from the stewardesses that I was interested in studying. And it was also a different time period. I was interested in looking at 66 to 75. He started working for the airline in, I think, the early 80s, just before I was born. But Pan Am did have an influence on my life, certainly. My mom is a really determined traveler. She was incredibly determined to wring every ounce of benefit out of her airline status. So she would pack us up for hot or cold, and pretty much and then we would go to the airport and get on whatever plane had 4 free seats. So we knew we were either going someplace warm or someplace cold, and that was it. She would pretty much every vacation or long weekend, we were going somewhere. It was a weird childhood, but really, really excellent. And I think it really made me a writer in a way, and a journalist. I grew up very accustomed to being around people that didn't speak the same language as me, or didn't look like me, or act like what I saw back home necessarily. And I grew up very curious about that.
So from the childhood experiences you had and then writing this book, how has that changed your perceptions of air travel now?
I mean, it's given me a huge amount of reverence for flight crew. I think, it's kind of maddening. I've been asked, even in a couple of interviews recently, about the state of air travel today, and people seem to want me to be very disparaging of the lack of glamour in air travel today, and all I can really think about is how flight crew, they're first responders. They're asked to respond to an incredible amount of variable things. Like if you think about it, they're tasked with keeping everyone on a plane safe. That's first and foremost. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And if they're doing that, then we should all be really grateful. And instead, they're kind of treated as, we're customer service representatives. And people go to them with complaints about the sizes of the peanut package or whatever. And it just seems pretty ridiculous to me.
So how do you think these stewardesses of the jet age era redefined the profession as we know it today?
They completely changed it. As I said earlier, when in the 1960s, when most of them began flying, it was a job that was seen as a 2-year stint for young, pretty, mostly white women. By the end of the 1970s, the flight crews had been racially integrated, which was huge. They were older. They were no longer required to retire upon marriage. Men were flying. So by the end of the 70s, flight crews were really starting to represent America, the people that live in it, rather than just, a pretty homogenous group of young white women.
So I'm about 3/4 of the way through the book, which is excellent. And I encourage everyone to get a copy. And I know that Derek posted a link to it in the chat, but some of the things that really moved me the most were your descriptions about the charter flights to Vietnam. Mm. And I don't know how much history of Vietnam you had. I mean, for me and my age, it was a big shadow growing up. Mm. How was it recording such intense first-person accounts of this chapter in history?
It was very intense. A lot of these women had not been asked about their experiences until I was asking them about them, in part because sexism. They were not the pop culture aspect of the pop culture perception of the role as being this job that women performed for a couple of years in order to shop and go on dates was not, it didn't fit, what they were actually doing. And so they were never really asked about these incredibly intense experiences, flying soldiers. They would watch coffins being loaded into their very plane, and they would, I heard stories of soldiers with PTSD running down the aisles. I heard about a man who tried to open the rear door and jump out rather than go back into combat on a return from a R&R. I've heard a lot of stories, and so then they would, come back to their home base in LA or San Francisco, and they would want to decompress, and then they would go to these cocktail parties and these, and they would sit there and listen to, young men pontificating about the politics of the day, and they would never, if they tried to interject, with an opinion about the Vietnam War, because they had considered experience of its human consequences, they were ignored, really. So they just kind of clammed up. They didn't really talk very much about it. It was really intense for me to hear these stories, but it was an honor, a huge honor.
So Delta Airlines, which of course, we have here at PDX, they fly flights from PDX to Europe and Asia, bought Pan Am's international routes when Pan Am stopped flying. And I'm curious, in your discussion with the stewardesses, was it an emotional discussion about the demise of Pan Am and the sort of end of an era?
Incredibly. What I realized over the course of interviewing these women was that Pan Am as a corporate entity was really intertwined with their sense of identity in a way, because if you think about it, they were not raised, when they went to high school, women weren't allowed to wear pants to school. They had to wear skirts. In the early 60s, women were getting married really young, right out of college. If they went to college, many were getting married right out of high school. Marriage was really the ironclad norm in a way. And, numbers reveal that it wasn't quite, there was divorce. It was happening. It wasn't as monolithic as all that, but they really grew up with this perception of these roles that they were supposed to play as, good girls. And Pan Am offered them a way out of that. It offered them a way to test themselves against different backdrops and to explore not only the world, but themselves. So their sense of, self-actualization was really intertwined with the airline. It's very strange. I got a question a couple of weeks ago from an interviewer who was asking me if they had any regret about their years flying. And I just kept thinking, like, absolutely, I could not think of a word that is more opposed to what they feel about their years flying. They for the most part, loved it. And of course, not everyone, nothing is 100%, right? There were some women who I talked to, I think 1 or 2 women who didn't love their flying years. But I talked to many, many dozens more who really did.
So as a kid, my family moved to Europe in 1972, and we took a Pan Am flight. And I remember the stewardess giving me the Pan Am wings pin and having that for many years. I don't, of course, know whatever happened to it. But I'm curious, as you were working on the book, did you come across or did you collect any Pan Am artifacts? And if you did, what do you hang on to and what do you cherish?
I only have one thing, and it was a gift from a stewardess who I now consider a good friend, named Becky, she's dubbed herself my pseudo hippie godmama. She read my book about Cuba, and I had a communist fairy godfather in that, the figure, a man who got me a Cuban visa. And she said, "Fine, can I be your Pan Am pseudo hippie godmama?" And I said, "Sure." So she's a fantastic woman, and she gave me a beautiful silk scarf, a Burberry silk scarf with a print of a Pan Am flying boat on it, and it's just a watercolor image of it. It's really beautiful, and I cherish it.
So we're coming up towards the end of the hour. You're a seasoned traveler. You've written about Cuba. You've been all over the world with your family. You've done so much, good travel writing. But here we are, all, in our little houses with our Zooms during a pandemic. Where do you want to go when you can fly again?
My brain can't compute that. I really, we had to cancel a trip we hadn't bought tickets yet, but my husband and I had planned to take our infant son to Portugal, which is an easy flight from Boston, which is where we fly out of. It's a super easy plane ride, and we were thinking it would be the perfect first international trip for the little baby. And we were not able to do that. So Portugal, in my mind, lives as the place that we're going to go to first. But then 6 other places jump up to compete with that. So I can't decide.
And what are you working on now or next?
I'm working on another book. I'm too superstitious to go into it in detail, but suffice it to say that it is also about women who have a hard time sitting still.
Sounds great. I want to thank everyone who joined us, who asked some wonderful questions. Julia, thanks a lot for writing a really, really fantastic book. Again, I urge everyone to go and read it. It is a great slice of history, and you will enjoy it. I am thoroughly enjoying it, and I can't wait to see what is next for you, Julia. And I want to thank everyone. Tune in again. We will have programs coming up. As Derek said, we have our International Speakers Series coming up April 7th with Tom Colicchio. We've got some other things down the pipeline in April with Cass Sunstein. And it is always a pleasure to have you join us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will hopefully see you all soon. Thanks.